Hello! You're listening to Everyday Encouragement, Timeless Truths for Today, a weekly podcast designed to bring you snippets of encouragement to help you as you go about your day. I'm Jenny Guy, your host. Whenever we think about God, we usually think about His power and His might. We think about what He can do. But is there anything that God can't do? If so, what is it? The Bible says, yes, there are some things that God can't do. Today, we'll find out what they are. Let's get started. If you were asked to describe God, what would you say? Would you talk about His ability to be everywhere at the same time, His omnipresence? Would you mention His knowledge of all things past, present, and future, His omniscience? Would you focus on His limitless, all-encompassing power, His omnipotence? Yes, God is all of those things and more, and so far your description would be accurate. But as you were describing Him, would it occur to you that maybe there were some things He can't or won't do? If so, what do you think those things would be? I think it's important for us to also know what God can't or won't do. For if we know what those things are, they will help us know and understand Him better. And when we know God better, we can rely on Him and trust Him more. We don't have to guess about what God will or won't do, for the Bible clearly tells us what those things are. Let's look at some of them. They will help us develop a description of God that is more relatable than just describing Him as omnipresent, omniscient, and omnipotent. First, God cannot lie. Period. End of discussion. We find that characteristic in the 19th verse of the 23rd chapter of the book of Numbers in the Old Testament. That verse says, God is not human that He should lie. So, no matter how extraordinary a promise or statement of His might seem to you, because God said it, you can rest knowing that He is watching over His word to perform it. Second, God cannot deny His nature or who He is. One of God's defining traits is that He is faithful to Himself and His character. For example, God has made a covenant with us. We call it the New Testament. God honors covenants. He doesn't break them. This means that even if we don't uphold our end of our covenant with God, He remains faithful to us. We learn the reason why God is faithful in the 13th verse of the 2nd chapter of 2 Timothy. That verse says, if we are faithless, He remains faithful, for He cannot disown Himself. Recently, when I faced a situation in which I was finding it difficult to believe that God would work something out for me, this verse came to mind. As I thought about it, I realized the verse means that in those times when I find it hard to believe God, those are the very times I can count on Him remaining true to Himself, regardless of how I feel or what I believe about him. In that situation, I needed a specific provision. One of God's names is Jehovah Jireh, meaning the Lord will provide. Being true to himself in my circumstance meant that God would provide somehow, some way. I didn't have to know how God would provide or what he would do. All this verse was encouraging me to do was to believe that God would honor himself by being faithful to his name of Jehovah Jireh. God worked the situation out. He was indeed my faithful Jehovah Jireh. That experience taught me that I could rely on God's nature, which requires him to be faithful to himself. I learned I could depend on that characteristic, especially when my faith is shaky, for God will always remain steadfast to who he is. Let's say that if instead of needing provision, I had needed a peaceful resolution to a dispute. If that had been my need, then I could have called on God by his name of Jehovah Sabaoth, which means the Lord of hosts. Or I could have called on his name of Jehovah Shalom, which means the Lord is peace. Regardless of which name I used, this verse is saying that God will always be true to himself. Third, God doesn't lose track of us. He is always watching over us. He doesn't take a break or go on vacation. He doesn't even take a nap. The third verse of Psalm 121 gives us that assurance. It says, "He will not let your foot slip. He who watches over you will not slumber." Now, this doesn't mean that God is like a big eye in the sky that is always monitoring us. Rather, the verse is saying that God is continually mindful of us. He never stops thinking about us. He doesn't lapse in his care of us. Fourth, God does not change. He is constant. The 17th verse in the first chapter of the book of James in the New Testament says, "Every good thing bestowed and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shifting shadow." What God was many years ago, he is today. And what he is today, he will be the same tomorrow. In other words, the miracle-working God of the Old and New Testaments is still working miracles today. And he will work miracles tomorrow. The loving God of the Old and New Testaments is still loving today. And he will continue being loving tomorrow. The holy God of the Old and New Testaments is still holy today, and he will still be holy tomorrow. The last trait I want to mention today is something which God won't do. It concerns his interaction with us. In Romans, the 2nd chapter and the 11th verse, we read, "For God does not show favoritism." That verse is short and to the point. There is no mistaking its meaning. The older members of the church in which I grew up used to say, "There are no big I's or little U's with God." In addition to supporting their statement, this verse also means that what God has done for someone else, He will do for you, and He will do for me. Knowing what God can't or won't do should comfort and encourage us. Our faith may wobble when we're standing on one of the Bible's promises of protection, provision, or healing. Our faith can get shaky, especially when what we're looking for takes longer to show up than we would like. During those times when we're waiting on answers to our prayers, we can be comforted and our faith strengthened when we remember these facts about God. He cannot lie. He cannot deny who He is, for He is always true to Himself. God doesn't ever lose sight of us, for He watches over us constantly. God doesn't change. His nature and character are the same now as they were centuries ago and as they will be in the centuries to come. And finally, God doesn't play favorites. As we remember that God is everywhere, He is all-powerful, and He is all-knowing. Let's also remember these things that He can't or won't do. I hope you heard something today that has encouraged you and possibly given you something new to think about that will motivate or inspire you. If you would like a PDF copy of the show notes for this episode of Everyday Encouragement, Timeless Truths for Today, visit my website at jguypublisher.com. New episodes are published each week on Wednesday. I hope you'll join me for another installment of Everyday Encouragement, Timeless Truths for Today. Well, that's it for now. Until next time, be encouraged.